I'm Ash Prakasan, and I generally go by Ash. Here are my social media handles in case you want to reach out to me after the talk. So, today I want to start with a few numbers. The Linux platform changes 9 times an hour. Approximately 10,000 lines of code are added to Linux every day. Some 5,000 lines are modified, and roughly 8,000 lines of code are removed from Linux every day. And this is by far the highest velocity, most effective software development process in the history of computing. And this would not be possible if it weren't for open source and open source communities, which is my topic for the talk today. So, for open source to become this phenomenal thing that powers massive projects like Linux, there were a few things that had to happen. So, let's take a look at the timeline of events that led to the evolution of open source. And like all stories, this also begins with once upon a time. Once upon a time, through the 50s, 60s, and up until the 70s, all software was free. Mostly software would come bundled right along with the hardware itself and with no extra cost. Source code was open for modification and for use. Most of the work was going on in universities, and they would often share their work in the spirit of academic knowledge sharing. IBM was like a leader at this time, and they would also release their source code from time to time. And then came the 80s, when Silicon Valley was starting to become this place where you could start companies and make money. And companies like Microsoft and Apple were coming up, and the idea of proprietary software was starting to catch on. And Microsoft was a real pioneer in the idea of proprietary software. However, there were this other bunch of people, hackers and hobbyists, who were very strongly against the idea of proprietary software, mostly on the grounds of principles. And there was this real dichotomy of ideas starting to take shape in this era. And there was a letter written by Bill Gates. It was titled An Open Letter to Hackers and Hobbyists, and this appeared in the Homebrew magazine. This really shows the tension between these two groups at the time. Let me share a few quotes from here. So he says, as majority of hobbies must be aware, most of you steal your software. Hardware must be paid for, but software is something to share. How is this fair? He seems angry, I think it's fair to say. And then he goes on to say, one thing you do is prevent good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? What hobbyist can put 3 man-years into programming, finding all bugs, and documenting his product, and then distribute it for free? It kind of makes sense, but the irony here is that Microsoft later acquired GitHub in 2008 in one of its priciest ever acquisitions for some $7.5 billion or some crazy amount like that. And then in 1985, the free software movement was established by Richard Stallman. Richard Stallman is known as the founding father of free software movement. He laid the philosophical, technical, and legal foundations for what later became open source. And here we have this archetype of a scruffy hacker who stands against everything corporate, and they are fighting for the most fundamental of ideas, individual freedom. And here free doesn't mean free of cost. Stallman has explained it multiple times, like free like in free speech, not as in free beer. And once these foundations were laid, the stage was set for the revolution of Linux to happen. And I call this a revolution because Linux adopted this style of software development that violated all software engineering principles that were known at the time. Nobody expected Linux to be successful because they were going against the norm of keeping complexity to a minimum, having closely managed goals, and having really small teams that report to one person. And here, on the contrary, development was happening over the internet and in the public eye. This was truly decentralized and democratized in a way that had never happened before. And at its heart was this huge community of developers who were continuously giving feedback during the software development cycle. And this, in fact, this massive independent peer reviews was resulted in the tremendous success of Linux. And once Linux became successful, other companies also adopted the philosophy of open source, and then open source went mainstream in 2008 with GitHub. Today, it won't surprise anybody when I say this, that 99% of software projects use open source. And that's because the amount of software required to produce a good quality technical product or service is so huge that it can overwhelm even the biggest of communities. I hope the Linux story shows us that an inclusive and healthy community is very important. It is critical to any open source ecosystem. And for the most part, open source communities are great. They are very inspiring, highly motivated, and collaboration is generally kind-hearted and open-spirited, and it's truly cross-cultural. Like you would see instances of developers working who are from countries that are political enemies, and they are working together on the same code base. That's pretty cool. However, there are challenges as well. Keeping a community friendly is difficult, and especially as it scales and grows, it becomes more difficult, because if you have a lot of people and somebody decides to yell at somebody else, then there's pretty much nothing one can do about it. And with so many people, there's bound to be different viewpoints. And of course, it's okay to have different viewpoints. What is not okay is that we yell them at each other. I want to share this comment that appeared in Closure Reddit. Starts with "fuck Closure." There, I've said it, and God, it feels good. And then they go on to say, "I say it with much admiration and respect to the members of the community." So this is bizarre. Rich Hickey, who is the creator of Closure, actually wrote a really nice, long, and heartfelt response to this comment. And apparently, he saw this while he was sitting down to work on closure-related things on a weekend, after having spent the whole week working on closure-related things. And it's easy to see how someone can get disheartened when they're putting in so much time and effort into something. I'll read out some parts that stand out to me from his response. "Every time I have to process such a diatribe and its aftermath and its effects on myself, my family, and my coworkers, I have to struggle back from why should I bother? And every time it gets harder to justify to myself and my family that it's worth the time, energy, and emotional burden." You can clearly see that he's hurt. And closer home, in the Scala community, if you follow Scala Twitter, you might be aware that there is some contention between type level and Zio communities. And honestly, it seems emotionally difficult for all parties who are involved. And during a recent such exchange, I really don't want to get into the details of what happened, but this is what Martin Odeski had to say. "I think this disqualifies both 2B and type level from further conversation. And here's the part that stands out to me again. You can do what you want, but I am sick of this kind of politics." He also seems frustrated and drained. And to me, this response seems emotionally very similar to what Rich Hickey had to say in the previous slide. And if you are new to the community, you might get curious to know what's going on here. Like, the problem is that even to begin to understand the roots of this contention, there is so much material, so much stuff going back years that you have to comb through. And even then, you would not really know what's happening, let alone pick a side. Because there's a lot that's happening behind the scenes. Not everything is playing out in the public eye, so you can't make up your mind. And I'm sure this has resulted in some loss of productivity on both sides. Here's what one commenter had to say. I tried to read all the stuff about this topic, and it seems very confusing and hard to understand. Same sentiments. I think we can all get on board with this next person. This starts with a question. It's like, okay, I'm a bit afraid to ask, but who wins this, Zio or cats? And the response is, we all lose because of this. And I'm sure at some point, most of us would have thought, why is this even happening? Why can't we just get along? I mean, I don't see people yelling at each other when I go to work or when I'm at a conference like this or on the streets. So that brings me to part 2 of my talk, which is the why. I think it's because places have a specific purpose. Like when we go to work, maybe we get pulled into a discussion, but then we have to get back to things that need to get done. And in a conference like this, probably you're here to listen to what the speakers have to say or connect with like-minded people. And if at all you get caught up in an unpleasant discussion at some point, you'll most probably just excuse yourself because that's not what you're here for. But on a social media platform like Twitter, you can keep engaging with someone for as long as you want. And not just that, you can go back and post that perfect comeback whenever it occurs to you. There is no time window of expiration on a thread after which you can't revive it, really. So that's one thing. And then there is a second reason for this. And I think it's because the social media platforms are designed for our interactions to go poorly. I want to elaborate on this point a bit. So, what is the most valuable currency on a social media platform? It is our attention. I'm sure they all started with the idea of building better tools and connecting people and making the world a better place. But unfortunately, their business model depends on how long they can hold our attention. And this becomes a compelling factor behind every design or algorithmic decision that is made on this platform. I'd like you to hold on to that thought while I introduce to you the psychology of moral outrage. Moral outrage is when we feel angry or emotional or upset about somebody else's bad behavior, someone else's bad social behavior, immoral behavior. And there are brain imaging studies that show that when people act on their moral outrage, for instance, we call somebody out on their bad behavior, the reward centers of our brain light up. We feel good about it. And this has an evolutionary reason. It encourages behaviors that create safer communities. But the point is that in today's times, we live in peaceful times, and there's not much going on around us to get outraged about. However, if we could just turn to Twitter or Reddit or Hacker News, there's somehow always enough shitty behavior going on there that needs to be called out. And this is not an accident or a coincidence. This is because online communities have created this ecosystem that selects for the most outrageous behaviors and combines it with a platform where it's easier than ever before to share that outrage. Now, there's another factor that adds on to this, which is decontextualization of a person. When we actually talk to somebody in the real world and let's say we say something mean, their face goes sad and that doesn't make us feel good. But when we post a comment online to, say, at Tango Dango, which is not a real name and we don't know the person behind that, there's no real face to it, and you can easily say something like Tango Dango is an idiot and feel pretty good about yourself. So from tonality of voice to the body language and facial expression, in a real-world interaction, we are continuously getting cues and feedbacks that model our behavior, and that is absent on a social media platform interaction. Another way of decontextualizing a conversation would be by limiting the number of characters available to somebody. There is no nuance that can be conveyed in 280 characters. And yet another way would be limiting the feedback available. So in a real instance, when you would say something like, hey, that was hurtful, the best way to react to an online content would be to go dislike or downvote. So that doesn't help either. When we combine this big moral outrage machinery that we just talked about with the nameless, faceless interactions, what we have is the perfect recipe for viral content. And now, for the last part of my talk, what can we do about it? And perhaps this is the most important part. When we interact, sometimes, especially us engineers, we tend to caught up in this certain kind of thought process that goes like, surely we are all logical people here, and given the same set of facts, we can all come to the same conclusion. And can't we just figure out the right answer using logic and reasoning? But the problem is that mostly that's not how things work. People can come to different conclusions based on their past experiences, their outlook, and their priorities in life. For example, I want to elaborate on this a little bit more by taking an example. So let's say we are discussing something like, should a library have symbolic operators? Someone might say yes, and maybe that's the kind of person who prioritizes things like brevity of code or ergonomics of API design. And on the other extreme, we could have somebody who says, no, there should not be symbolic operators because it affects the simplicity and readability of the code, or maybe they are new and they find it hard to Google for symbolic operators. So what is the right answer in this case? Realizing that mutual understanding is more important than mutual agreement is step one. My next point is about intentional communication, and this is a pattern of communication we can all follow online, and it's best explained with an example. Let's say we want to post a comment or a question somewhere. We start with an intent, and intent could be something like to learn, and follow it up with a background. Let's say background is something like, okay, I have spent 15 years doing Java and just started doing Scala 2 months back. And then you come to the question. Question could be, why is Scala compiler slow? Now, given the intent and background, it makes it harder to interpret this question in a combative way. Otherwise, it might have been easy to misinterpret this question and read it with a negative tonality or like a complaint, like, why is the Scala compiler so slow? So, and while answering the question, again, you can follow the same pattern. We restate the question, and then either we can ask for clarification, which in this case could be something like, are you using a macro-based library? Or instead, go ahead and answer the question. Okay, Scala is more syntax rich, which means it takes a little bit more longer than Java, or whatever the technical details of the answer might be in this case. So the important point is that in this particular conversational flow where both parties are engaging in intentional communication, yelling angrily at each other is not a valid state. It's harder to get there. And Postel's law is a good guiding principle here. Be conservative in what you accept and, be conservative in what you send out and be liberal in what you accept. Try to parse every question or comment that is posed to you through this intent background information pattern, and also try to follow it yourself when you engage with somebody online and post a question somewhere. A third way of dealing with this could be to use some de-escalation heuristics. Now, this is not fully fleshed out. These are just thoughts that I want to throw out there for others to maybe work on or think about. And a lot of these things could be automated or baked right into the social media platform itself. For example, if you're engaging a little bit too much on a thread, there could be a pop-up asking, how much time would you like to spend on this? And after 5 minutes or whatever, depending on whatever your answer was, maybe you can get a helpful warning saying, okay, do you want to move on to something else or do you want to continue doing this? Another alternative could be, it could look for inflammatory words in a comment or a question before it is posted and suggest some alternatives with the intention of taking the conversation to a constructive conclusion, to a de-escalating point. And there could be other helpful suggestions when two people are engaging with each other on threads. Maybe it's better to take that conversation to a private chat or some other means. And another thing that might be really valuable is private feedback. So we talked a little bit about the upvote, downvote thing earlier with the decontextualizing of a communication. When somebody gets a bunch of downvotes or dislikes, they're not getting any constructive feedback there. There's nothing much that they can act on. They can only look at all the dislikes and perhaps think to themselves, okay, haters gonna hate, what can you do? A better way to deal with this would be to give more pointed feedback, and that too privately. On an educational post, more helpful feedback could be, was it off topic, or was it wordy, or was it confusing, versus whether it was encouraging or clear or concise, so on. And lastly, I cannot stress enough on the role of empathetic leadership in a community. And if you happen to be a leader in a community in any sort of way, then please hold yourself to higher standards. Hold yourself to higher standards of patience, tolerance, and acceptance. And take out that extra time to help a beginner out, because not only does it help the person directly, it sets the right tone and right example for others to follow. And ultimately, I'm not here to say that here's one way that works, because people are going to have different priorities, people are going to always have different perspectives, and there is going to be difference of opinion. But what is important is for us to realize that a lot of the times in open source communities, and a lot of the times, especially in our Scala community, people are getting hurt. And it gets emotionally difficult to see people getting hurt, people that you care about, your colleagues, your mentors, or your friends getting hurt or being called names and all that. It's difficult for everybody. And my hope from this talk is that we can at least begin to think about these things a little bit and be kinder in our interactions with each other and try to interpret each other's perspectives and points of view charitably. Thank you. Thank you for your time and attention.